This month's theme was chosen by our Leeds chapter and illustrated here by Jeffrey Phillips. We're really proud to welcome up Andres Cuervo, who is a web and VR, a virtual reality and augmented reality artist, also an educator, developer, and human-computer interaction researcher. Their work focuses on usability, accessibility, generative design, and pushing through the boundaries in this amazing industry. So please help me give a warm welcome to Andres.
Hi, good morning. I'm Andres Cuervo. Thank you for the introduction. And yeah, this is my talk, and it has two very long titles. Games as Language, a personal journey to a new medium. The subtitle, I think, is really important here. I say to a new medium because even though games have been around for millennia, kicking around a ball or something, and video games have been around for decades now, I'm convinced that games can be something more, that they can be not just pastimes, but that they can replace the way we interact with things. The way we currently think about interacting with things, or at least the sort of think about the future of interacting with things, is usually something like this, something like Minority Report. And there's a lot of things I don't like about this. The color scheme is really dark. And if you think about if this was your computer at work, it would be really tiring to move your hand all the time, right? So there are a lot of things I don't like about this. So as I talk about my journey with games, just keep this in the back of your mind. This is sort of the design that I'm trying to sort of design against, and I'll get back to it at the end. So this is going to be sort of the structure of my talk. I conceive of my journey with games first as a gamer, someone who's consumed games for like a very long time, and then sort of learning how to create games. And finally where I am today, where I want to sort of take us into the future, which is as an educator, someone who thinks about games as both as a medium and as a tool, as a whole new thing. So to start off, I've been playing games for the majority of my life. The story goes that when I was 5 or 6, my mom wanted to encourage me to read. And she walked into a Toys R Us and asked for a game that had a lot of reading in it. And this was before sort of educational mobile games were a thing. And the employee rightly suggested Pokemon. And it's funny because it's definitely a game that was meant for entertainment, but being 5 or 6, I didn't have the vocabulary or the reading skills to get through it, and so I actually have like really fervent memories of like being frustrated, like wanting to play Pokemon, and so angrily going to read a book or something, like a level 1 children's book, right? And so it accomplished its goal, right? I learned how to read. And on top of that, Pokemon became a through line. This game was a conversation starter, not just in elementary school, but through high school and even to college. And it's actually such a big factor in my life that I now have a Pokeball on my arm. And so the next natural question is, if games were such a big part of my life, was I ever interested in making them? And the natural answer, the like short answer to that is yes. The longer answer is that whenever I would think about making games as a child, I would have this quote running through my mind: "Don't just play games, make them. That's where the money is." And so this is something my grandmother would tell me. Which in retrospect, right now, years later, it was actually really encouraging. But at the time, that last part really bothered me. This idea that that's where the money is, that this like fun hobby, creative thing could turn into like the thing I was supposed to do, that it could turn into work and a career, right? I didn't want to do things that people were telling me to do. I just wanted to have fun. So I sort of weirdly, because I was encouraged to make games, I didn't make games for a very long time. And I eventually did, get the encouragement to create games again, but it wasn't until college. So these are 2 games that I made for a game design class that I took as an elective in my computer science program. And I made these both with a small team of 4 people over a semester. And again, this was in my computer science program. So it was actually, even though the class was called game design, it was more about what we might say like the dry side of games, right? How to program things, what the graphics do and stuff. But when we did talk about games, and through the course of building these, the thing that I sort of discovered was that the art of game design is mostly concerned with this concept of game feel. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's how it feels to play a game. And maybe one of the best examples of that is this is Mario's Jump. So one of the first sort of like archetypical games. And even though it looks pretty simple, it's actually kind of surprising how many, like so I won't get too deep into the technicality of it, but sort of the interesting thing to note about this jump is that there are more frames that go into his jump up than to his jump down. And what that ends up translating to is it feeling really fast. So even though you and I can't see it on the screen here, if I were to take out those milliseconds of frames, whenever you would press the button, you would actually begin to feel a delay. There are people who, when we slow down the jumps in games, start to, just by milliseconds, start to say, oh, this character feels sluggish or slow or weird or laggy. And so there's this really like incredible there's really incredible human reason behind a technical decision. And that's sort of where the art of game design begins to see itself, right? And that's one thing that I learned in the process of making these games, right? This concept of like designing games is more about people and less about sort of all the technical things that go into it. And I would say the second big like game-like thing that I created was this interactive experience that I did for my creative writing degree. So I was initially, I did a lot of science fiction. I was going to propose a short story, and then through a series of strange events, I ended up proposing a virtual reality narrative as my final creative writing thesis. And I was a big outlier, and it was a very weird time. But the cool thing was that it sort of taught me, it reinforced all the things I learned in that game design class. So I started off with this idea of represented here by a tree. I wanted to start off with a sort of a journey, a meditation about nature, right? And in order to sort of expose the sort of tranquility of nature, I wanted to put you into a surreal forest and have you interact with trees that get weirder and weirder. And this was all good and well when it was a static story, when it was a written story. But the thing about creative writing is that you sort of, at least for my first 3 years, I had it drilled into me to show, don't tell. And that's good advice when you're writing in text. And the thing about creating a virtual reality narrative or any sort of interactive narrative is that advice begins to fail you. The only thing I can do is show you, right? Like that's the default action. I'm literally, especially for virtual reality, I put a thing over your head and you're looking at stuff, right? And it's no longer sufficient to say, show, don't tell. The quip that I developed, and it's sort of in the name, it's not like this is groundbreaking, is interact, don't just show. So it goes from something like this, a very static narrative, to originally I started having a thing where sort of things would animate around you. And that wasn't very exciting. So I ended up doing, there you go. Yeah, I ended up doing something like this. This isn't the final version. I don't actually have footage of the trees animating, but you can sort of get the gist here, which is that whenever this pink circle, which would be your line of sight, whenever it would interact with a thing in the experience, it would change color, it would make a sound. And it really, like, sort of, even though this ended up being a very simple, simple technical project, it sort of drove home this idea that building interactive narratives, building games is about combining simple things to make sure that people feel good, that it feels interesting to interact with a thing, no matter how sort of complex or simple the story you're trying to tell is. So I sort of had this long tail of playing games and then making games, and even though I still do that today, I would say that I've sort of transitioned into teaching how to do the things that I've learned how to do so far. And that started, that sort of, it didn't come out of nowhere. From the time I was in high school, I would teach people, I would teach middle schoolers, which is kind of weird to think about now. I don't know how I started teaching when I was that young, but I would teach people how to control these robots, and these are called NXT robots, and they're really fun to program. One, because they're really simple, and two, they're fun to build because they're actually built in partnership with the Lego Corporation. So these little joints and these, like, most of the little sort of the way you put the thing together is literally playing with Lego. And so I already had this natural interest in sort of teaching people programming and math and hardware to create interesting things with technology. And the next version of that is teaching workshops. So I've taught a few workshops on virtual reality and augmented reality, and this is the result from our very own Maiowa of one of the augmented reality workshops that I did. And yeah, I think I would have been pretty satisfied with this, right? This is a very long journey from where I started, right, with the Game Boy, right? This is a much more immersive, much more interactive, and I feel like I've learned a lot. But you'll remember that there's this nagging thing, right, which initially seems very divorced, right? This is sort of the way we think about interacting with technology. And this is even a little bit disingenuous, right? What I'm actually annoyed with are things like this. Is like, if you think about it, there's this person, Brett Victor, who calls this the picture under glass model. And you can see that if you think about, okay, what do we do if we want more space? Well, we add more glass, right? We make it bigger. And what if we want even more space? Well, we add even more glass, right? This thing down here, I didn't even know that they made. It's basically just a giant Surface Windows tablet. But we can also add, some glass to your laptop. And it's really just like the sort of the most groundbreaking thing we've had for about the past decade and a half is pictures under glass. And that feels really disingenuous to me. It feels like there's something missing because computers are so powerful, and I've spent so long learning how to make them interactive and playable. It feels like we should have something more, and the something more that I've begun to find is sort of facilitated by a dynamic land. So there's this place in Oakland, just a few blocks from here, called Dynamic Land, and it's a research center and community space. And instead of starting off by describing it, I'm just going to show you this kind of magical book. This artist, Cuervo, made. And the system is set up with projectors and cameras, and they can see these little dots. So you can see here that we have, right, these are woodcut trees, and this little book is called, it's kind of difficult to make out, but this book is called The Owl's Surprise. And so it's a very short book. It starts off with a little projected owl. Once upon a time, there was an owl who lived by a tree. And this is the weird amoeba tree, and there's the owl. The end. And it's really short, but it's also really, really magical to me. It's a radically different way of interacting with, with not screens, right? It's absolutely not screens. It's wood and paper. And in fact, you can do things, layer the pieces of paper over pieces of foam core to create these boxes. You can make, your own sorts of pop-up books. You can make whatever this is, right? You can make anything that you can imagine. So that whatever the little googly eyes point at, it gets projected into this little surface. And the thing I love about this way of programming, or this way of making, is that it's drastically not screens. I'm beginning to realize that it sort of encourages turning everything into a game. It encourages just placing down pieces of paper to see what happens. And most of all, it encourages sitting around a table. So if you think about a screen, or you think about Tom Cruise in his Minority Report thing, it really encourages being alone. It encourages sort of interfaces built for one. Whereas when we're here, when we're standing around a table, or when we're projecting something on a wall, and we can just tape things up, it really encourages standing around a room and creating games to like graph things, or creating sculptures, or creating music. And I sort of see all of this as an example of games with a very broad definition, where the definition that I've come to is interactive art with a reward. And sometimes the reward is just learning a thing, or sometimes it's just having a good piece of music at the end, or it's having a pretty thing that animates. And so one of the best examples of this, specifically for education, comes from this tweet from Mei Lee Ko. Best feeling making a thing for kids in Dynamic Land and then seeing how it plays out, pun intended. You can see here that as these blocks are placed, you get both a textual representation, a count, 3 dots, but you also get a picture. And you can see over here that there's other simulations happening, and everything feels both like at once like a game and like an educational experience. And my dream is that as this grows, as this turns into a public thing, and as like there begin to be dynamic lands in every city, and this becomes a place where people go, we start building things like this, and that you can build something in 5 minutes, not just to teach something, but to make music or make art or write a love letter or keep a diary or write research papers, that eventually this becomes the way that we interact with computers completely. And I think it'd be magical if the way that we interacted with computers wasn't pictures on glass or buttons, but through games, little games. So that's my journey with games, and that's kind of my vision for the future of games. Thank you.